Welcome to the Voodoo Power Podcast.
Welcome to Plates and Pancakes. We're sitting down today with Missy Mitchell-McBeth. Coach Mitchell-McBeth is the owner of Safe Iron, a company based on educating sport coaches on strength and conditioning. She has over 18 years of experience in the coaching profession. She spent 6 years as the head strength and conditioning coach at Byron Nelson High School. There she oversaw the development of 13 different sports, over 500 athletes, and trained all sport coaches to assist in the weight room. Prior to Byron Nelson, she was a senior assistant strength and conditioning coach at TCU for 7 years. There she handled the development of women's indoor volleyball, women's basketball, and women's golf programs, and she assisted with football. Before becoming a full-time strength and conditioning professional, Mitchell-McBeth was a high school sport coach for 4 years at Copperas Cove, Texas. She holds a master's degree in exercise physiology from Baylor University and has a SCCC, a CSCS, USAW, FRC, and RPR Level 1 certifications. She also co-owns the Conditioning Project, a business that seeks to improve the health of other coaches. And welcome to the show, Coach.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited. I got to follow you kind of on Twitter a little bit this summer. Looks like you had a lot of speaking engagements. How'd that go?
I did. I think I had 3 this summer plus a webinar. So I did actually 3 different topics on back-to-back weekends, which was a little bit challenging just from the perspective of traveling and preparing all that content. But each audience was a little bit different. So I tailored the messaging to who I thought would be there. So it was a good challenge for me. And I really enjoy speaking. Oddly enough, I'm very introverted, but for some reason, like getting up there, like I find that really fun and engaging. So it was great. It was a great experience.
Now, this last week or so, I've had a lot of chance to research some podcasts you've done, and you're writing on Simplifaster. And I was kind of telling you before the show, I'm incredibly jealous of the way you're able to write an article. It makes it fun to read. I found myself reading articles that didn't even really apply to me because of your style of writing. It just kind of kept me reading. But you did an article on presenting, and man, that was just full of some really good stuff. Learning to tailor for your audience, like you said. How long has that taken to kind of, I wouldn't say master your craft, but build that into something that you're really proud of?
To be honest, it's just a work in progress continually because I actually talked to Gary Schofield, if you know him. He was a strength and conditioning coach at Greater Atlanta Christian for a number of years and was one of the founders of the NHSCA, which is how I came into contact with him. And I kind of had the discussion with him of, does this get easier? Like, do you get less nervous before you go on? Do you feel more competent when you're up there? And he's like, honestly, no, like I'm just as nervous, if not more, because I feel like every time you get up there, your expectation level rises. And it's not necessarily the expectation level of the audience. It's my own personal set of expectations for myself, which is why I do, like I talk about in the article, that I do spend a lot of time prepping my content and I do practice. I know that there are very organic, off-the-cuff speakers that can just get up there and roll with it and talk about what they've done for the last 18 years coaching. Unfortunately, that's not me. So I have to put in the work to get better. And from a personal development standpoint, like I'm actually going to attend an Art of Coaching event here this fall because I just want to brush up on some of my speaking skills. So a lot of the things that I wrote about in that article are things that were hard-learned lessons for me. I also, due to my full-time job, which is working at Powerlift, as well as my position on the board of the National High School Strength Coaches Association, I attend a ton of clinics. And so I see presentations done really, really well, and I see them done really, really poorly. And so that's kind of the gist of where that article came from.
It was a well-written article. You know, I picked a ton of tips up. I don't necessarily speak in front of people, but obviously these go out where people can hear them. And you covered a lot of topics that I've thought about in the past and things that I wanted to get better with. And the way you wrote about them, they definitely have me kind of evaluating when I finish a podcast of what needs to be done to make it a little bit more palatable or where it's easy to listen to, I guess.
Sure. And I think something that I didn't write about in that article, but what made me become more comfortable speaking in front of other people is my role at Byron Nelson. You mentioned in my bio that I trained sport coaches. And basically I started off like I'd give them their program and then I'd say, hey, come in and meet with me. I need your staff to come in and meet. And it's like in the high school setting, that's impossible. if there is a time for a meeting, they need to be meeting about their sport. So I was like, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to disseminate a 4-week training program and all the requisite information and coaching cues and that kind of stuff? So I just loaded up a Google Drive folder full of videos. And so I just got comfortable being in front of a camera, speaking and giving instructions. And so really, without even thinking about it, the next time I went to give a presentation, I was just so much more fluid in my presentation style. I was so much more comfortable basically teaching a class is what it is. You're teaching a short form class in a 1-minute instructional video. And so that's something where I didn't write about it in that article, but it's probably a good tip is film yourself giving instructions, and you're going to learn kind of some of your quirks and I'm really, really bad with filler words. I have to slow myself down, consciously think, to not do but, and my favorite one is all right. When I transition slides or something, getting in front of a camera can actually really help you see those things that you don't notice because they're just so ingrained in your speech patterns.
Every coach that listens to this, they're not going to present. They're not going to do some of these things, but where it could help, like you're saying, film yourself, write stuff down, make articles, whether they ever get published or not. Have you found that maybe that helps with the soft skills of coaching? Like you're more aware of how you present yourself?
Absolutely. I think one thing that if you're a good presenter, everything is about how the audience is receiving your message, right? And that's something that I talk about in the article is that very often, you gave my bio up front. Very often speakers get introduced and then they stand up there and they go through another 10 to 15 minute talk about themselves, their specific context, every coaching stop they've had along the way. While context can be relevant, the audience isn't getting anything out of that, right? And so back to the point of athletes, when you're speaking, when you're presenting and developing content, everything is about audience perception. And so I think that I was able to then take that into the weight room. And just as I would look out in the audience and see how are people grabbing what I'm saying, do I need to change my affect? Do I need to potentially pivot and talk about something different? Is a different anecdote going to be better in the storytelling of this presentation? Same thing when you're looking at a room full of athletes. What's going to resonate with them? Because ultimately it's about them and their training process, their perception of what you have to say. I was working with one of our middle schools and we had a young coach and I went to observe, and he's extremely intelligent. He knows a ton about strength and conditioning, but I stand there and watch him talk to this group of 7th grade boys for 15 minutes, during which time he used the phrase cervical extension, like to try to correct their movement in an RDL. And I'm like, and by that time the bell rings and it's time for them to go, and they didn't do anything that day. And it's like the kids were just like politely trying, you know what I mean? So I feel like getting up and speaking helps you be more perceptive about how people are receiving your messaging. And I think it also forces you to be more clear and concise with everything that you're saying up there. And I think that we need to be very clear and concise with our athletes when we're coaching them, because we don't have a ton of time at the high school level, nor do we have a lot of attention span that we're working with. So it's really, really important that we say less to communicate more to them.
It seems like, you can very quickly figure out who you like to listen to and who you don't like to listen to, but we don't ever think about it going the other way. Do people actually like to listen to what you have to say? So I can see where that would carry over into the classroom really well. Everything's getting ready to start or has started. I mean, this will come out in a couple of weeks, so we're going to be a little bit past it. But player safety, I mean, you're in Texas. You've had an incredible amount of heat. We finally got cooled off here a little bit. You're going to have that to deal with. You're going to have possibly coaches trying to catch up on maybe where they missed this summer, putting athletes in different situations. How do we enter the first part of the season here in the safest way possible for our athletes?
I think you just touched on it. It's about athlete safety. And when that becomes the number one priority, I think that you're not going to see issues, right? Because what happens is coaches make the number one priority being tough on kids when they first get back. and demonstrating to them that you should have been here all summer. I was here all summer. Why weren't you? Well, probably because I don't want to come work out for a coach that has exactly the mindset that we're discussing, where it's like, you're coming back, gotcha. Like, they don't want to be around you. That's why they're not coming. They don't see value in what you're doing. So you have to ask yourself, number one, do I want athletes to be afraid of coming back from summer and seeing me? Number two, is that safe for them? Is that physically what's best? If they weren't here all summer for whatever reason, whether it's because they're a terrible human being and they're lazy and they don't want to be there, whether they don't like you and that's why they don't want to be there, they had a summer job, that's why they couldn't be there, their family travels, they didn't have a ride, there's a million reasons why they may not have been there, but they weren't there. That time is lost. It cannot be gotten back. What you can do is you can injure or kill that athlete upon return with improperly applied conditioning. So that's the scary side of things, right? And we see it all the time. You see lots of, in May and June, when the weather starts to heat up, you see a lot of heat related stuff. August, same deal. January, coming back from Christmas break, like here in Texas, we just had a case of, I think there were something like 10 kids hospitalized. Child Protective Services got involved. The coach you'll never convince me that any of these coaches don't believe that they're doing the right thing for kids. I think that they believe that by being tough on them and by trying to show them that they needed to show up, that they're building accountability or whatever. They're severely misguided in how they're doing it. But I think they have the athlete's best interest in heart. But they're going about it the wrong way. So the appropriate way, and the National Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association and the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association, which have not always vibed, they came together on a consensus statement, I believe, after the death of Jordan McNair in 2018 at the University of Maryland. And they put together a statement that said, hey, when you're coming back after a long break, there needs to be a 50% reduction in training volume and in training intensity in the first week. So whatever your highest training volume would be for a practice, for weights, for whatever it is, take that in half. So there's a couple ways we can do that. We can actually calculate like how many yards they ran, or you can just look at total time. If it's weight room, you can look at sets and rep and cut that in half very simply. You don't have to have GPS data and all that kind of stuff. So week 1, 50%. Week 2, 75%. Week 3, 90%. Week 4, you can be at 100%. That is going to allow you, because those are the coaches that, like, it's really important to them. It's a basketball coach, like trying to get ready for season, right? That's going to ensure that you have that athlete for season because you didn't injure them in week 1 trying to bring them back too fast. So the other things to factor in is, I even think about this on a Monday morning when I have a group of kids walk in. They've slept all weekend. They've missed several meals. Some of them may be in a financial situation where they don't get meals when they're at home. All right. So it's through no fault of their own. They're not hydrated. All right. So on Monday morning, we probably need to even pay attention, even after a 2 or potentially 3-day weekend. So athlete safety, I think I've mentioned Gary Schofield before. I think he talks about this when he presents. It's priority number 1, 2, 3, all the way through 1,000. When we get to number 1,000 and we're safe, then we can worry about priority number 1,001, and that's performance.
Getting everybody back, like you said, coaches really, I do feel like they have the athlete's best interest at heart, but sometimes it doesn't go the right direction. They sometimes will incorporate mental toughness workouts. And I got to hear you talk about this in a podcast. You know, as much as you think the mental toughness workouts are helping, they could actually be creating a scarcity mindset, because now you've taught the athlete to hold back. He or she is not going to give you their best because they know what's coming. So adjusting, figuring out what works where you can get the athlete conditioned, but not send them into like a fear mode of where they're going to end up. Setting that up, how have you worked with coaches before in the past to kind of figure that out?
So that kind of I'm going to kind of get off on a tangent here. I have my next upcoming presentation is called "You Can Teach an Old Coach New Tricks: How Force-Free Motivation Tactics Are Man's Best Friend in 2023," or something along those lines. So I was always I came from the collegiate level, It's a business model. It's serious. Like there's a lot of money on the line, all the things, right? So, and I'm also a coach that's been in 19 years. Punishment was just the norm. Like that's just what you did. An athlete's late, the whole team's doing something. Their toe is touching the line, we're starting over. Like we didn't get that rep right, like we're doing it again, like all the things. And so that was kind of my frame of mind, is like to hold people accountable, we have to punish them. But when you actually look at research, when you actually look at science, what punishment creates is exactly what you're talking about, that fear-based performance where I'm only going to do enough to just fly under the radar. So this concept really didn't click with me until honestly about 3 or 4 years ago. I transitioned to the high school level in 2016, 2017, somewhere in there. And what I noticed was, me going in with almost this, I don't want to say militaristic because I'm like very anti coaches thinking we're in the military. Go sign up at a recruiting office if that's your thing. Like the military would love to have you, but we're not. We're teaching hot potato and tag is what we do as coaches. So, but I came in with this almost like militaristic, this is how we did at the college level. And so like, this is what's going to work at the high school level. And I started to, again, observe my target audience, and they were just kind of like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you so serious? Because I call it advanced placement PE class. They're not all of them going to play collegiately. They're not super serious. So when they walk into their first weight room day or their first workout with you, that is potentially their first workout ever. And that's what is going to shape their mindset for their entire lives of what it feels like to go in and do resistance training, right? So when I realized that, I was like, okay, I need to change some things. So I kind of like backed off on some of that stuff. Like I didn't lower my standards necessarily, but I was a little bit more compassionate with like, okay, you're late. Like you're going to do something to get warmed up real quick, but we're not going to make a thing out of it. I'm not going to read you the riot act or like, be judge and jury on this stuff. Just here it is. You do these 5 things, you come jump in with warm up. We're never going to talk about it again. So then fast forward and I have 2 rescue dogs already. And we get 2 more puppies. And what you really want to do when you have 2 high anxiety adult dogs is you want to blend 2 high anxiety puppies in the mix. So now we have 4 high anxiety dogs, one of whom has very severe behavioral issues. She's actually upstairs with me right now. She cannot be with the other dogs because, she's on all kinds of medications and whatnot. So from that process, as my husband and I were introduced to a behavioral trainer, and she uses 100% force-free methods. So we do not use shock collars, prong collars. We don't yell at our dogs. We don't hit our dogs, none of that stuff. And so she starts to teach me about it, and I start to read about it, and I'm like, hold up. Like I would never hit my dog because it's going to create aggression with that dog and further anxiety. And it really doesn't teach them what I want them to do. So why is it that I'm effectively hitting kids with exercise as punishment? And so about the time I'm like having this shift in mindset, I have this kid that I just didn't like her. And I'll give that presentation. I'll talk about that in presentations or in front of other coaches, and they'll just look at me like, how dare you say that? And it's like, okay, listen, if that horrifies you, you either haven't coached very long or you're lying, because we all have kids that we just don't like for one reason or another. And I go in the weight room and I'm just like dreading. I'm like, oh, here she is. Right. So go in and she's doing something, and it's just, she's not a bad kid. She's just stubborn and like difficult, and like I just don't like her, right? And she's doing something and all the other kids just like love it, and like they love her, and she's silly and sweet and all the things. And I just look at her and what she's doing, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's my dog Violet. Like, because my dog Violet is the same way. Like all the other dogs love her, but she's super stubborn. Like I don't like training her. I make my husband handle her because I just don't want to deal with it. And in that moment it clicked. I'm like, I would never act towards my dog Violet the way that I'm acting towards this kid because that would make Violet turn her head and walk away from me. That would make her afraid of me. And yet that's exactly what I'm doing to this child every time she comes in the weight room, just by the fact that kids can tell, like, if you don't like them or whatever. And so it was like, in that instant, I just changed. Like, I just changed the way that I treated that kid. And I don't mean to say that I was like being super ugly to her or anything, but it was just like, you know how we get as coaches, like, you irritated me once. Okay. You irritated me twice. Okay. Now every time you irritate me from then on, it's D-Day every single time. And I just changed how I treated her. And all of a sudden it was like, I started to see all the good things in this kid that she was doing instead of all the flaws, right? So I think, I don't even remember how we got here with this presentation, but, the fear-based thing. I think that so often, like, we look to be authority figures and like hold kids accountable. And that's really important. But the way we should do that is not through punishment. The way we need to do that, and the way that we need to develop mental toughness, is through what's called self-determination theory, which basically has 3 parts that underlie motivation. And those 3 parts are autonomy. Athletes need to come in and feel like they have some choice. Now, if it's a 14-year-old kid, you're not going to get to choose what your weight room program is. But I can give you a simple choice between this hip mobility exercise and that one, and let you pick, right? That's a choice they get to have. So autonomy is the first one. Relatedness, they have to feel like they're connected to teammates, and they have to feel like they're connected to coaches. When we're that authoritarian or that dictator that's punishing them all the time, that's not a sense of connectedness. That's a fear-based strategy, basically. They're doing things for you as a coach. They're doing things for their team to avoid punishment. That's a playing not to lose mindset. That's not a playing to win mindset. So autonomy, connectedness, and the last one is competence. So athletes have to feel like they're improving, or they have to feel like they're good at something to be motivated to continue to do it. All right. And so that's, again, where that bringing them in for a conditioning test day one and showing them that, oh, you suck, you're out of shape. Well, they knew that to start with. It's not motivating to them. All right. And all you've shown them is that they're bad at something, and you're not motivating them. Okay. So autonomy, relatedness, and competence are 3 big components to mental toughness and to just general team culture, basically.
There was a lot of honesty in there that I don't think you normally get. I mean, you're willing to say things that people don't want to talk about, but are very true. Sometimes there's something about somebody that kind of rubs you wrong, and then they get wrote off and left behind, and what could have been a pretty decent athlete, or, grown into a great human, for whatever reason, there was just some flaw that a coach or somebody didn't like, and they just got pushed aside.
And I think, and this is not something that I share very often, but the dramatic conclusion of that story is that about 4 months after that, that little girl's mom died. And I think that, and actually the coaching staff didn't tell me. So I didn't find out until a couple months after the mom had passed away what had happened. And so I look at that, and I just imagine what it would feel like had I not changed my mindset towards that athlete. What would I feel like knowing that I had continued that the day after her mom died, and every day until I found out? You know what I mean? And so, and I pulled the kid out in the hall after I found out, and I was like, I am so sorry that I didn't know. No one told me. I'm so sorry I haven't said anything to you, but also, like, I'm so proud that I didn't know, because she just came in like nothing had happened and just did everything that was asked of her from that time on, without any, feeling sorry for herself or any signs that things were going on. So I tell that part of the story for anyone that's listening, that, like, maybe you have an athlete that's struggling. Sometimes there's stuff going on outside that is way bigger than your stupid weight room. Or sometimes things may develop. So I think it's really, really important, particularly with young kids, that we stop spending so much time trying to assess their motivation and just try to change the motivation, right? Like we spend so much time trying to figure out like, why is so-and-so not doing such and such? Well, who cares? Just figure out how to get them to do better. Or we like look at a practice and we're like, why is this going so badly? Who cares? Shut it down, regress the skill, and then work them back into it kind of deal.
Kids have a really good way of hiding a lot of stuff. So yeah, you won't see a lot of the stuff that happens at their house or some of the problems they face because they don't want other kids to know. They don't want teachers to know. So there may be a lot going on under the surface that you as a coach would never know about. Now, we talked about this a little bit before the show, but I'd heard you talk about this and I thought this was incredible. But helping athletes gain in training age so that you can set up a situation where you had kids as coaches project. The podcast I had listened to, you just started implementing it, so I don't know how it worked out and what are some of the things you've seen from it. But I was pretty curious about, are you still doing that and how has it grown?
Sure. So if you back up all the way to, I've always had kids work out in groups of 3. And so it's like you got your primary exercise, you got your secondary exercise, which is basically like mobility, like something, if we're doing a squat, you're going to do some upper body that's not going to conflict. And then you've got this third person that's like hanging out. Well, sport coaches don't like a third person hanging out. So what are we going to do with that person to ensure that they're still getting adequate rest before they go like hit a heavy set or whatever? So I was like, well, we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I can't coach every single rep in this room, but I've got a group of athletes that probably can. So I started encouraging them to coach one another. Okay, cool. So I'd done that for years with like a very limited amount of success. And because there was no criteria in place. And that's one thing that I've tried to get really, really good at in the last few years is like very specific criteria with athletes. And so I was listening to Joey Bergelis speak. Don't even remember where I saw him, or he and I may have had a phone conversation about this. And he was talking about that one of his KPIs for his session is that the group has to have 10 elite level coaching efforts. And so he starts talking, he's like, this is what an elite level coaching effort looks like to me. And I was like, okay, cool. So I sit back and I think, and I'm like, what do I want my kids actually to do? When they're coaching each other, exactly what do I want them to say? They don't know how to coach a squat other than they'll stand beside the one and be like, do like this, and like motion it for them, but there's no correction within a rep for that. So for each of my exercises that I was requiring these coaching efforts, I came up with 3 to 4 criteria. So with squat, it was feet flat, torso vertical, hamstring on calf, and then feel the quad coming out of the bottom because we were doing an ass to grass squat basically. So those are the 4 things. And then it was like, okay, I want you down on a knee, laser focused on the person that you're coaching. So these are the 4 criteria. And so I had numbers 1 through 10 up on the board. And every time, like, we started off with check marks. And then one of the coaches was like, why don't we write their names on the board? And I was like, why don't we write their names on the board? That's so smart, right? So we start writing their names on the board. And then I was like, wait a minute, why are we not tracking coach of the month? Like, what kid has the most elite level coaching efforts? And then why are we not tracking coach of the year? So it became a positive reinforcement system where it's like, 1, I'm keeping them busy. 2, the coaches absolutely love it because it's a leadership skill. 3, the kids are gaining a lot of competence, what we talked about with self-determination theory, because they are getting like patted on the back and told great job because they're coaching each other. Then when they step in and they get under the bar, they're more cognizant of what they're going to do because they've just finished talking about it. So we saw a tremendous, and for me, that allowed me where, my experience at the high school level was 2 weight rooms, 1 of me. I would see most groups 1 time a week. It's really difficult to build a relationship with kids, to find anything out about them when you see them once a week. There's a group of 60, like you hardly know their names, right? So that allowed me to, instead of like having to coach every single rep and be all over the room all the time and then monitoring to make sure the coaches are coaching, the actual adult coaches are coaching, that allowed me to just like sit back and one, I wasn't correcting things all the time. The kids were correcting each other. So I wasn't like the evil overlord coming to tell them what they're doing wrong. Like I was literally the one that's walking around telling them what they're doing right. And two, it allowed me to go have a conversation with another coach or with another athlete and see how they were doing, or ask them about their tournament that weekend or whatever it was. So we did that. I will say that my girls groups liked doing it better than my boys groups. I don't necessarily think that that's a gender thing. I really don't. I just think it was the particular teams that I was working with at the time. My boys basketball team they were awesome. They were super fun kids, but they weren't like high energy hype kids. A lot of them were very introverted. So then it's like you put them in a setting where you're asking them to be extroverted and coach, and like they're a little nervous. So that took a lot more coercion out of me to get them to do that stuff. But overall, I was really pleased with the system. When I start coaching, I'm going to start working for a volleyball club in November. I'm going to implement that there as well, because we're going to have a very limited amount of time. I'll have 24 kids in a group, basically one of me, and that allows me to have more coaching eyes in the room. So it's something where I think it, even another layer to it is I would coach sometimes 10 groups a day at the high school level. Like at some point, you kind of get tired of saying the same things over and over again. And as much as I'm like, we got to, power through the boredom, like it is nice to then just go have a different conversation with an athlete other than walking around and being like, feet flat, torso vertical, like whatever your coaching cues are for the day. So overall, 100% recommend implementing a system like that. You don't have to get as intricate as we did, where we're taking down names and tracking. I have this like big chart, and I had like a gold whistle that they would get at the end of the month, and they get their picture on social media. You don't have to get that crazy with it, but I highly recommend teaching your kids to coach one another from a skill development standpoint, but also from a leadership standpoint.
Now, there's a couple different ways we could go with that, but I'll head this way first and then maybe come back around on the competitive side here in a little bit. But turning the gym into a classroom where it's more than just a bar and weights, where you're actually educating your athletes in a way that they can obviously help other kids, or as they grow up, be able to move into a public gym and get the gains they need and know what they're doing. How are you able to do that where it becomes more than just a weight room?
I really think, again, like you're going back to that self-determination theory where you've got autonomy, like giving them controlled choices so that one day when they do walk into a commercial gym as an adult, they already have experience with figuring out what they're going to do. Two, just being really open to answering questions. Because kids they're all on Instagram, they're all on TikTok. And so they're seeing in their feeds, they're seeing a ton of stuff from fitness influencers and all that kind of stuff. And instead of just being like, oh no, that's stupid, don't do that, take that opportunity, because that's something that they're displaying interest in, and take that opportunity to educate them. So I'm trying to think of, a kid came up with something one day on knee pain. And she's like, I saw that such and such. And I was like, well, actually, and like, I take him over to the whiteboard and I start, showing him stuff and teaching him like a little bit of anatomy. So I think using their interest in certain things to kind of cultivate some, I guess, organic lessons, because I don't think, and I think there are some, this wasn't my model because I was specifically training athletes within the team setting for sports, but there are some individuals that are full-time high school strength coaches that everything occurs within the context of a PE class. So they do have a formal curriculum that they use on some days. But for me, it was more about just letting them make those choices, letting them feel really good about themselves so that it was something that they wanted to do when they were older, or if they didn't come train in the summer. Most of the kids were still like, yeah, I was at the rec center all summer. And most coaches would be like, oh, boo, you should have been here. And I'm like, cool, you did something, So I think those are just little ways that we can help shape it into a classroom. How do we do the larger thing, which is shape it into a classroom in the perspective of administration and the people making decisions? That I think has to do with how we present ourselves as professionals and using the narrative that you would in education, where you're talking about, key performance indicators to us are, gosh, I don't even know what they're called. I'm saying use the narrative, but like your standardized testing stuff, right? Same thing. You get a standardized test for biology in the classroom. Well, we have a standardized test for the vertical jump. And then we have a progressive curriculum to improve our vertical jump. So being able to communicate that to administrators, which I was actually never evaluated by my administrators when I was at Byron Nelson, but had they come in, it's like we had a self-directed classroom because they're all coaching each other. We have tons of engagement. We have no one off task. And you can see over the course of the semester, everybody's getting better because the curriculum is progressive.
To fall back into competitive sports, you said you were getting ready to help a club volleyball team. They're not going anywhere. They've established themselves. People are bought in. That's where we're going. But listening to you talk about that, there's a lot of work that gets put in by the athlete over the weekend or, through the week at their practices. Depends when it is, if it's their competitive season or if it's not. So you're going to get kids back Monday at school or for their sports that are pretty beat up. And you spoke about indicator kids. I guess I'd never labeled them like that, but once you said that, it dawned on me. There's always going to be kids that you can talk to that will give you insight into what they're doing. Using those kids to adjust and being willing to adjust what you're doing to keep benefiting them. How much work and preparation goes into that?
I don't know that there's necessarily work and preparation on my end, rather just watching the load that they're experiencing in games. Because, high school strength coach, I was not at every practice. I'm definitely not at their club practices. I'm not at their club tournaments. So it was like going and seeing what level of competitor they are at their high school games. That tells me my volleyball outside hitter is a 6 rotation starter. She takes 80 swings in a match, right? Our middle hitter, she played 3 rotations and she took 10 swings in a match. Okay. Those two kids have a very different state walking in the next day in the weight room. I have to, one, gauge that myself of what training modifications need to be made. But then based on how kids handle the training load in season, I can then make the assessment that the specific 6 rotation outside hitter never complained. When I would make the training modifications, she was kind of like, do I have to? Because she didn't want to do things differently than the other players. So it's like, then when she comes in an off season, I can have a conversation with her about, hey, so-and-so, how many games did you play this weekend? How does your shoulder feel? Is your back hurting? Because she had back problems or whatever. Like, what do we need to do to modify your training load today? And those kids will a lot of times, oh, no, nothing, I'm good. Like your kids that are like, I'm good, when as a coach that they're not, those are the kids that you need to be having conversations with, because those are the ones that if you can start to get that information out of them, then you will have a better idea of what's going on with the rest of the room. Because the flip side of that is your 3 rotation, 10 swings a game hitter is going to be like, the sky is falling. It was 5-set match. I'm so tired. Like, we can't do anything today. And I'm like, you took 10 swings last night. Like, chill. So I think having those kids where like, what their playing volume is like, but then allowing them to give you input on how they feel can help you manage the overall training volume of the team. And then kind of get a better assessment for what's actually happening. Like, what actually happened in practice the day before? Was conditioning really that hard? Or is everybody just like in the Chicken Little, sky is falling, we want to get out of something? And then the other thing that I've always done with that is, and I particularly did this with our girls basketball program at Byron Nelson. So they went basically straight out of high school season right into AAU. So there's just no break, but then we're running our quote unquote off season, which we do want to make some gains because we get an extra day in the weight room during that time, but I don't want to kill them for AAU. So I would tell them, and I would even do this in season. I'm like, listen, if you come to me as a group and you say, we really, really need a day off, like I had this whole like recovery series that we would do. You really need to stay off. You really need Super Six was our big thing. Everybody wanted to do Super Six. Like you really need Super Six. We will go through that anytime you guys absolutely need it, but we're not going to play this card all the time. And so knowing that, do you want to do it today? And they'd all be like, again, I'm giving them autonomy. So they go as a group and they decide, like, do we really need it or do we want to save it? And 9 out of 10 times, like the first time that I would present those options for them, they'd be like, you know what? I think when we get deeper into district play, I think we're going to need it then. And I'm not trying to say that like I would only give them one card, but we all know that like if you give athletes an infinite number of times to get out of things, most of them are going to try to get out of them. So trying to, again, have those kids that can indicate like what the overall workload really looks like and making decisions based off that. But then also always giving kids a voice in the matter and letting them know that, listen, like if you really need it, I'm going to make the modification to my program. I think that that goes a long way, not just with their load management, but also with their understanding and their buy-in to your program, because now you're not just this person in the weight room telling them to lift. Now you're a person that's looking at their training process as a whole and helping them with their athletic career.
As a strength and conditioning coach, I know you have an extensive background in volleyball. You played college volleyball. You coached high school volleyball. You've worked with it at the college level. You really understand the sport. You understand the workloads of the sport. How much time have you had to dig into other sports to understand what the true workload is? And I guess, for an example, I read one of your articles, you were talking about jumps in volleyball. If you would just talk to somebody on the street, they would assume that max effort plyometrics is probably the key because they jump all the time. But when you start breaking down the percentages, you had 40% of the jumps are over 15 inches, but only 9 of them are over 20 inches, 9%. But 100% of the focus is placed on the 9%. Well, other sports could definitely have a perception of them that's not necessarily true. So while not learning to coach the sport, understanding what's involved with helping your athletes be better at it, how much experience and time is invested into that?
Oh gosh, so much. So one of my first assignments at TCU was to work with women's golf. And I had never done anything other than putt-putt. I didn't really understand. I mean, like I understood nothing. I didn't understand swing mechanics, nothing. So it's like, who did I learn that from? I had to go to the sport coach and be like, I mean, I can look at your sport and say like, okay, thoracic spine rotation is going to be important. Hip mobility is important. Lumbar, lumbopelvic stability is going to be important. Like these things are important for your sport. But when we started to get into the like nitty gritty, like kids would be bringing me videos and they're like, I have this swing fault. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at. And so I would learn from the athletes and like, I would let them bring in and bring their stuff in. And they would say, this is what my impact position looks like. For context, here's this professional golfer. This is what it needs to look like. I would say, oh, you have a hip internal rotation deficit. Here's how we can train around that. So there's a lot of, when you're stepping into a new sport, you have to go and you have to learn about, for me, it starts with injury. Like what are the common injuries of the sport? If I can know that, that's going to give me a clue into what some really important pieces to include in my programming are. Then from a, speed, power, strength standpoint, like what are the sport demands there? So like with, or from a conditioning standpoint, like basketball players, they never really hit top end speed, but they have to be tremendously well conditioned. So we're going to focus a lot on that. So when you do, and then at the high school level, this is a very unpopular opinion. Everybody's like, oh, well, we have to do all these specific things for different sports. I'm like, no, you don't. Like it's general physical preparation. You're working with such a low training age that anything you do is going to get them better. People get caught up in sets and reps. And it's like, people have success with 1x20. People have success with 5x5. Like that's really not what matters. What matters is teaching them a very broad movement vocabulary, making sure that they're proficient in those movements, making sure that we're doing things for tissue tolerance. Like you mentioned, plyometrics. Like I'm huge on extensive plyometrics, where it's higher volume, lower intensity to develop that tissue tolerance for athletes. But it's important as you get into the higher levels of sport, it becomes that much more important to understand the nuances of their skill, of their sport, so that you can better align your training program with that. So yeah, a lot of work went into it. Even I'd played basketball in high school, and I was in charge of women's basketball at TCU, but playing high school basketball and understanding how to train a collegiate basketball player are two completely different things. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, whether it's talking shop with colleagues, whether it's just humbling yourself and going to a sport coach and being like, help me, like what is important specifically for your program? Getting online and looking at, like I was actually talking to one of the sports scientists down at Texas A&M today about, and my friend that's the athletic trainer for USC indoor and beach volleyball. And we were talking about basically running volume in volleyball. And there's not a lot of research out there, obviously, but it's like the total distance covered during a match or the number of accelerations, decelerations, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of that data exists and is out there. Go find it, research it, because that's going to give you a lot of insight into how to train that sport.
And I'm sure GPS has changed a lot of it too, because now athletes are wearing more technology and then it can all be tracked so easily. Where before you had to have a manager or somebody with a trained eye that was watching and trying to keep track, or going back into film and trying to watch a game to see how many, like you said, accelerations they have or whatever the case may be.
Sure. And my dirty little secret of my coaching career is that I never had a lick of technology. I will be this November getting my first piece of technology ever, because I was never at the collegiate level. We just didn't have the resources at TCU. And at the time, tech wasn't as big in the strength and conditioning space. That's gotten really, really big in the last 7 or 8 years. And I simply didn't have the resources at the high school level. I've had people say things like high school coaches can't possibly do this without technology. You're doing your athletes a disservice. I'm like, we won a state championship. We were number 1 ranked in the nation. We had no technology. I do consulting for a program that won a state championship last year. They didn't have technology. It can be done without it. Certainly, it's very helpful, like you said, to get that GPS data for your specific context, the system that you're running, the athletes that you have. But if you don't have it, you can go get somebody else's data, and then you can reverse engineer your practices and your training volumes based on what they give you.
It's all possible. They did it for years, and we've created athletes. World records have stood clear back to the early 1900s. So, I mean, they didn't have much technology.
Yep.
Now, you touched on it in that conversation there. It seems like there's always a push for special strengths, and I understand special strengths are needed, but in the process, GPP gets overlooked or rabbit holed as something not necessarily needed, when in fact, I've heard you talk about it before, you could use GPP to fill all the buckets up that are lacking, where some of your special strength stuff, those buckets are overflowing. Incorporating GPP to help your athletes and realizing the benefits of it. Maybe when did you notice that? Early on in your career, maybe, or whatever the case may be, and then how have you been able to implement that and make your athletes better?
I guess I just never, the first, man, I hope, sometimes I'm like, I hope nobody listens to this podcast that knows me, because they're going to know who I'm talking about. But one of the first coaches that I ever worked with, we had these contraptions, and she called them leapers. And it was a belt that went around the kid's waist, and then it had tubing. And then the tubing went to their, like, they held it in their hands, and then the tubing went down to their ankles too. So it was like 4 pieces of tubing. I hope people can understand. So basically they were to then do their plyos and like spike approaches with that. And like, of course the tubing was like so heavy, like the kid's elbow isn't even like clearing rib height, which is like not how you would swing at a volleyball. So it's like, I looked at that, and again, I'm a second year high school sport coach. I don't really have a strength and conditioning background, but I look at it and I'm like, that's stupid. Like, why are we doing that? But I mean, it's like the kids are bought in because it looks like volleyball. And I'm like, that arm swing is terrible. And like, that hurts my shoulder just looking at it. Plus like the resistance on the tubing it's just like snapping their heels back to their butt. Like, what are we doing? So I guess, I don't know if it was that experience or just kind of like some sense of physics, maybe, that I look at some of these things that people were doing and I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Or if it does make sense, we're already taking 100 block jumps in practice in volleyball or 60 spike approaches or like whatever it is. Why are we doing more of that? Like, what are we not getting? So, you look at, you're not getting strength. You're not getting a lot of posterior chain development in a lot of sports. You're not getting those extensive plyos that are going to build tissue tolerance for your higher output stuff, your intensive plyos. Those are buckets that are not being filled in their sport practice necessarily. So how can we do things that are, like you said, not going to overflow those buckets, but are going to supplement those buckets so that we are a healthier, more robust athlete?
And I know we've talked about this. Mark Hoover was on a while back, and he, made a very good point about it, how little it actually takes to get a high school athlete strong. So do you think sometimes maybe coaches overestimate what it takes, or they think that more is better when in reality it takes very little, and just back it off and let the time it takes to develop come into play?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is like ego of, look what my program did. My athletes got stronger. I think I've seen Zach Dakin talk. Zach Dakin is the head baseball strength coach at TCU and a friend. I think he's been on record saying that, like, without even touching a weight, just due to puberty, they're going to gain like 20% strength every single year of their high school career. So it's like coaches get really like juiced up about, oh, I'm making him so much stronger. I'm making him bigger, better, or bigger, faster, stronger. And I'm like, that's puberty is doing all of those things for you. You're just riding its coattails. But are your athletes getting faster? Like, are they actually improving in their sport? Are they available because they're not injured? So I think that, yeah, like, because there's such a capacity to change, I think that people get really like hungry and really fixated on that, where it's like they want to create this really strong athlete. And I don't really think to be honest, I don't think you're going to find a lot of kids in high school that have like reached that point of diminishing returns. But for me, because we have so little training time compared to what I had at the collegiate level, like I was training kids an hour and a half a week at the high school level, because I have such little training time, instead of like spending all of my time filling that strength bucket, I'm going to put a little bit in each one of these buckets to make sure that I'm building a well-rounded athlete. So I'll always say this, I'm never going to beat you in a powerlifting meet. That's not going to happen. I'm probably not going to, I might beat you in a track meet, all right? But where I'm going to beat you is on the court, because my athletes are going to be well-conditioned. They're going to be fast. They're going to be resilient. They're going to be strong enough, all right? And then we're going to have that serving as the foundation for technical skill development. Because when you start pushing nothing but strength or nothing but conditioning, well, all of a sudden you're putting them in a really fatigued state where they can't develop skill. And that's kind of like the number one KPI, is being able to play your sport.
And I've researched West Side quite a bit. I really like Louis Simmons. I just enjoy what he's put out there, through his lifetime. But he never gave up on GPP. Even as strong as his guys were, the most elite power lifters in the world, GPP was still a fundamental part of their program, staying in shape to do the sport you want to do and getting everything all around better conditioned. So if it's good enough for an elite power lifter, I'm sure it's plenty fine for a high school athlete.
Right. Probably okay for your third string defensive back.
Exactly. And you were talking about Coach Dakett. He coached at Missouri State, which isn't far from me. We got to talk about that. He was on the podcast a while back, and man, what a great guy he is. And yeah, he was really honest with that. Is like, you have free tests running through your kids that is totally legal because it's the body manufacturing it.
Yep.
It's going to do what it's going to do. Don't take credit for the gains of Mother Nature. Everybody wants quick results. They want to get an athlete in a weight room. We're going to make them strong fast. We're going to get them conditioned fast. But that athlete's going to be there 4 years. prioritizing the long-term goals and seeing the potential in your young athletes to help them develop in what is eventually going to help the team in the future. Understanding you're investing. How do you keep all that in perspective and not just pick the low-hanging fruit?
Well, I like the cooking analogy where it's like you can't, if I want to bake cookies, I know all the strength coaches are into steaks. I like cookies. So if I want to cook my cookies, I can't turn the oven up to 700 degrees and cook them twice as fast, right? I burn them. And once they're burned, I can't unburn them. And it's the same thing with athlete development. So I just always keep that perspective in mind of like, despite the fact that I've said several times during the course of this podcast, oh, we don't have that much time in the week. We only have an hour a week or an hour and a half a week over the course of 52 weeks, over the course of really a 6-year development strategy when you include the middle school. Again, going back to Zach, I think it's something like 500 sessions or somewhere along those lines that you can get in that 600, or you can get in that 6-year time span. So it's like, I know that sport coaches want everybody to be ready today. I would love that as well, as if we were ready today. Like I would love to not have to go through these like long drawn out beginner squat progressions. And like, I would just love it if we could all come in and jump under 500 pounds and like, yay, I'm the best strength coach ever because we are all 500-pound squatters. But recognizing that you do have to slow cook them. Everything is a moving target with a high school kid because sophomore year for a boy, he's going to start hitting puberty. He may shoot up 6 inches in the course of 2 months. And all of a sudden it's like things are not sitting where they were before. With females, all of a sudden they have weight in a different area in their body that it wasn't there before. Now all of a sudden they have to realize from a balance, from a proprioception standpoint, how do I play my sport? How do I move when I suddenly have a 4-pound weight on my chest and wider hips than I had 3 months ago? So I think that when you put development into the forefront of development of them as an athlete, but also how their bodies are developing and changing, it should shift your perspective away from getting them ready now and recognizing that we've got a long way to go and we've got a lot of time to get there. Let's do it right so that we can, if we send them to the next level, we send them there healthy. If the next level is simply just being a person that goes to the gym, we send them there healthy as well. Because I think it's a real shame to, if we're talking about starting in the middle school, we're talking about 12 to 17-year-old children. Like it is a real shame to tear up kids' bodies again in the name of playing hot potato and tag, which is what we do for a living as coaches. I know that everybody wants to think that like we're saving the world one Friday night win at a time, but you're not. Like, so make sure that you're doing what's right for kids physically, as well as some of the mental and emotional stuff that we've touched on.
Now we got to talking there just a little bit about the differences in boys and girls and, how they develop size-wise and different things like that. I get to talk to a lot of male coaches working back with female athletes. You're in the opposite role. So seeing it from your perspective, if there's advice that you could give some male coaches working with female athletes, what would it be?
Same expectations that you would have for boys. Because I think what you see is this mindset of like, I got to be softer on them. And boys sport culture is different, in that, again, we'll be honest in this, I will go in and I'll let words fly that I probably wouldn't say in front of my mom in a boys' weight room. And that is because that is the language that they hear from their sport coaches. I one day was walking across the weight room in one of my volleyball sessions and I kicked by accident a horizontal bumper plate storage. And I was like, oh shit. And all the girls looked at me and I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, I apologize, ladies, for being just terrible today. You know what I mean? So, but at the same time, like, that doesn't mean that girls are soft, and it doesn't mean that we have to treat them differently. And it doesn't mean that, like, we have to lower our expectations. Your athletes, like, you need to train a volleyball player like a volleyball player, a basketball player like a basketball player. And whatever those expectations are, number one, they should align with what the coach wants. Number two, they should align with the individual. Like I talked about my dogs earlier, I've got 4 dogs. Each one of them, I have a different criteria for those dogs. So address like it's an N of one approach. Don't address your girls' teams like girls. Don't address that female athlete like a female. Address her as a person and fulfill those needs, hold her to those expectations versus necessarily making it a dichotomy based on a gender.
I think that's pretty sound advice. Sometimes we try to find different ways to relate or whatever the case may be, but just going at it that way, just straightforward approach and work.
And I think, like, because the question that I always get, I get it in job interviews, I get it from people all the time. It's like, well, how do you deal with male athletes being a female? And I'm like, or I get the question of like, what's it like to be a female in the strength and conditioning industry? And I'm like, I don't really know, honestly, because I don't have a frame of reference for what it feels like to be a man in the strength and conditioning industry. All I have is my experience. And that could be because I'm a female. It could have nothing to do with being a female. I don't know. So, my experience with working with male athletes is just like girls don't care that their coach is a male, boys don't really care that their coach is a female. The people who care are the male sport coaches. Like, they're generally the ones that maybe have an issue, but athletes are really smart and they know who knows stuff. They know, like, if you just walk in and you coach with confidence, whether you're male coaching females or vice versa, and you coach that says, I care about you, I care about your development, I'm going to talk to you and have conversations about you and your development. They don't care if you're purple with green spots, like, or you have a tail. Like, all they care about is that you are able to get them better.
If they see gains at the end of the day and they know they're progressing in their sport, it doesn't matter who taught them how to do that. They just know they're better. And the respect comes no matter who the coach is. The respect comes with the gains and what you're willing to do to help the athlete and get to know them. I know I've kept you a while. You have a very, very busy life. And I'm sure you talk about strength and conditioning an incredible amount. So we'll go off topic here, just a couple questions, and then I'll let you go. But I think I heard you say you grew up in Wichita Falls.
I did, not to be confused with Wichita, Kansas, Wichita Falls, Texas.
Yes, and Monty Sparkman, he's from Burke-Burnett.
Burke-Burnett, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be the neighboring town. So I know both of those towns very well. When I was a kid, Leeds shut down up here at the car plant, and my grandpa worked at Leeds, so they had to send those guys all over the country. So they sent them down to Wichita Falls. So I spent a lot of summers down there, and just a unique place that I thoroughly enjoyed. One of the places I remember from my childhood. It was just a great place to spend some time.
Unique is the perfect word for Wichita Falls, I think.
Yeah, it's a pretty big mix. You got the Cowboys, you got the military, you got quite a few guys that worked at some of the plants around there. It's just you get into the Cajun influence. It's just everybody kind of thrown in together in one town.
Yeah, I will say what was nice about it, and what we always, because my entire family lives in the Metroplex now, and it's like in Wichita Falls, it was 10 minutes to get anywhere you needed to go or less. And now it's like there's traffic. It's an hour to get anywhere. So that there are some advantages of living in a town that it's like 120,000 people. Definite advantages. However, not my favorite weather patterns up there. Lots of tornadoes, and somehow it's even hotter than it is here. And I think it's like 105 outside at 7:00 at night. So
one of the things I remember about Wichita Falls, and then we'll change subjects or whatever, but up here they didn't have Targets yet. And Wichita Falls had Targets when I was a kid. I don't remember how. I can tell you how young I was. I remember hearing Friends and Loaf Places for the first time when it just come out in the parking lot of Target.
And that is quite a memory. Wichita Falls is very fancy. We had things like Olive Garden and Red Lobster. Those were our fancy places to eat. So yeah.
All right, so I'll try to hit another passion of yours. It's not strength and conditioning, and then I'll let you go. But the dogs, adopting dogs and working with dogs. How did that move into you and your husband's life?
Oh gosh. Apparently because we're really dumb. So when we got married, he had two labs. And then I had a dog that I had actually rescued from a shelter when I was in college. And I don't really know how I decided to just rescue a dog one day, but I did. And so then when his dogs passed away, I rescued another one from a shelter who's my 10-year-old dog, who's just like the chillest dog ever. And so then I think at that time we had maybe just two, rescued another one, had three, one passed away, had the two that we have now. And then the one that passed away was like my heart dog. And I loved her more than anything I can bear, more than I can explain. And so then I was like, I'm never getting another dog. I'm too hurt. And like 2 months later, I get puppy fever. And so I look for a dog. I want a black and white border collie mix. I want a puppy. I want a female. So I'm like searching Pet Finder and trying to find all this, trying to find exactly the right dog. And I find her in Longview, Texas. When I get to the shelter, there's a couple in line in front of me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get this dog. I've taken off work. I've come out here all this way. It's like 3 hours. So I look to see what they have. Other dogs on their, I don't want to say inventory, but in the shelter. And I find my other dog. And I was like, okay, well, if they get that one, then I'll go ahead and look at this other one. So I end up looking at both puppies and I come home with two puppies. And so then we have 4 dogs. And as I said, they all have like some behavioral stuff. So I would say we're all in between walking them. They eat out of food puzzles. They do enrichment activities, just general, like loving them. I work from home now primarily. So all in, I would say we spend at least 2 hours just devoted to the dogs during the day, which is great because one of them wakes us up at 4 a.m. So it gives us plenty of time to do so. But yeah, I don't really know that it was a calculated decision to get in rescuing. I think my next go around, because of the experience we're having right now, where we have one that's so severe that she has to be isolated from the other ones and she's not rehomable because of some behavioral stuff. We're the only home that can, and we've had our behavioral vet. We would go to a fancy vet for her. We have a fancy behavioral trainer. They're both like, you are the only home this dog can live in. You're her only shot. And I'm like, great, no pressure. But yeah, I think that after this, I'm going to pay about $1 million for a dog bred for temperament. And then I'm just going to donate money to the rescue and foster system so I can have like a normal life. But overall, I'm a dog person. I love dogs. It impacted my coaching in a way that I never could have imagined. It's made me more compassionate, of people with parenting stuff. We're not parents. And so people talk about kids and I'm like, oh, that's not relatable to me. And I'm like, well, it kind of is now, because I spend a lot of my day, basically like teaching someone how to act right in the house and feeding them and caretaking and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's our dog story.
I had a female black and white border collie that we bought in the parking lot of Walmart. And that was one of the best dogs I've ever had. But when we brought my youngest daughter home from the hospital, oh man, she was only a week old. We were going to some family for a gathering, and there was a sign that said border collies for sale at a house, and we pulled in and bought a male. And so he was the same age as my daughter, and we lost him a couple years ago. And man, I wouldn't have ever guessed losing a dog would be that hard. I mean, for 6 months, you saw him out of the corner of your eye and stuff like that, just places he was supposed to be. So you talking about losing some dogs back in there. I definitely know how tough that is. I'm sure some other people can relate too, but it's great.
And actually, interestingly enough, my heart dog that I said died and caused this whole chaos with other dogs, she was a black and white border collie mix that came from a Walmart parking lot as well. So
if people have never been around them, they're just incredibly smart dogs that will do anything for their owner. Both of these dogs, I worked horses for years. They would be right in the mix. I didn't necessarily want them in the mix, but they would always be in the mix. And my male, he would grab a horse's tail and swing around so he could get to the nose if he thought that horse needed to be turned. I mean, they're just so athletic and so smart. It's just
Yeah.
unbelievable. Well, Coach, I appreciate all your time. Hopefully we didn't get too far off topic, but I thought maybe you might get tired of talking strength and conditioning every day. So I appreciate the side conversations. So,
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on tonight.
it was a wonderful time, and I know how busy you are, so it means a lot that you took some time to come on. And if there's anything I can do for you in the future, please let me know.
Thank you.